Have you ever noticed that some people seem bothered by your presence, even though you've done absolutely nothing to them? People who change their tone of voice when you enter the room, try to downplay your opinions, distort your intentions, or make you question yourself for no apparent reason. What if I told you that this may not be happening because you're weak, insecure, or easy to manipulate, but precisely because you're beginning to see what they've spent their entire lives trying to hide? There is a profound reason why manipulators feel threatened by self-aware people. And that reason has nothing to do with intelligence, status, or external power. It has to do with something far rarer, the ability to look within yourself. Carl Jung once said, "Who looks outside, dreams. Who looks inside, awakens." And it is precisely this awakening that creates a problem for those who depend on other people's unconsciousness in order to maintain control. Because manipulation thrives in the dark. It requires people who are disconnected from their own feelings, needs, boundaries, and values. It needs individuals who don't question, who don't notice patterns, and who confuse guilt with responsibility. But what happens when someone begins to develop self-awareness? What happens when a person starts observing their own thoughts, identifying emotional wounds, and recognizing psychological triggers? Something changes, and that change is silent. It doesn't show on your face. It doesn't show in your clothes. It doesn't show in your words, but it is immediately noticed by those who spend their lives manipulating others. Perhaps you've experienced this yourself. The more self-aware you become, the more certain people seem to pull away. The more you learn to say no, the more resistance you encounter. The more you understand your own mind, the more uncomfortable you make those who would rather see you continue doubting yourself. The interesting thing is that many people interpret this the wrong way. They believe they're doing something wrong because they begin losing certain connections. They think they're becoming cold, difficult, or antisocial. But what if, in reality, you're simply seeing what once went unnoticed? According to Jung, until we make the unconscious conscious, it will direct our lives, and we will call it fate. That statement reveals a disturbing truth. A large part of human relationships is built on unconscious patterns, and when someone chooses to awaken, they inevitably begin to threaten the dynamics of those who were emotionally benefiting from their lack of awareness. In this video, you'll understand why manipulators hate self-aware people, the signs that reveal this invisible conflict, and most importantly, why developing self-awareness may be one of the most powerful forms of psychological protection that exists. Because there's something most people still haven't realized. Manipulators are not afraid of your physical strength, your money, or your social status. They're afraid of something far more dangerous. Something that once awakened within you makes it nearly impossible to be controlled in the same way again. And that's exactly where the most interesting part of this story begins. Before we continue, if this topic is already helping you see situations in your life differently, take a moment to leave a like. It may seem simple, but every like signals to the algorithm that this message should reach more people who are also trying to understand why certain relationships feel so confusing, exhausting, and emotionally draining. And I want to ask you a very sincere question. Have you ever felt that some people seemed uncomfortable with your clarity? Have you noticed someone acting differently once you started getting to know yourself better, setting boundaries, or recognizing manipulative behaviors that previously went unnoticed? If that's happened to you, write in the comments, "I awakened." That simple phrase may reveal far more about your journey than you realize. The comments on this channel often become a place where people with similar experiences realize they are not alone. And perhaps by sharing what you're feeling, you'll also help someone who is going through the exact same situation in silence. And if you enjoy content about depth psychology, self-knowledge, consciousness, human behavior, the shadow, emotional manipulation, and the teachings of Carl Jung, subscribe to the channel now. Because the next few minutes may completely change the way you interpret the people around you, and most importantly, the way you interpret yourself. Now, there's something most people never realize about manipulators, something that explains why they seem attracted to certain people but become deeply uncomfortable around others. And the answer isn't physical strength, status, or conventional intelligence. It's something much rarer, something Jung considered one of the greatest threats to any unconscious mechanism of control. And once you understand it, you may begin to see many events in your life from a completely different perspective. Do you know one of the most dangerous moments in any human relationship? It's not when someone yells at you. It's not when a person clearly reveals their intentions. It's not even when the manipulation becomes obvious. The truly dangerous moment happens when you still don't realize you're being influenced. And there's a reason some people spend years trapped in exhausting relationships, toxic friendships, or emotionally suffocating environments without fully understanding what's happening. They learned how to observe other people's behavior, but they never learned how to observe themselves. This is where the difference between a highly manipulable person and a self-aware person begins. Perhaps you found this video because something inside you has already started to awaken. Maybe there's a strange feeling you can't quite explain, a sense that certain people change when you're around, a feeling that some individuals seem to like you much more when you were more insecure, more available, and easier to influence. But suddenly, once you began trusting your own perception, something changed. The conversations became awkward, the compliments became less frequent, the criticism increased, the subtle attempts to make you doubt yourself became more common, and the inevitable question arose: why? Most people believe manipulators choose their victims solely based on emotional weakness. But reality is far more complex. Manipulators don't just look for fragile people. They look for people who are disconnected from themselves, people who don't know their own boundaries, people who feel guilty easily, people who don't recognize their own emotional patterns, people who are more concerned with pleasing others than understanding their own truth. And perhaps that description reminded you of a former version of yourself, because self-awareness rarely begins with strength. Most of the time, it begins with pain. It begins when you're tired of repeating the same cycles, tired of attracting the same kinds of people, tired of ending conversations wondering whether you overreacted, misunderstood something, or should have stayed silent. This is exactly what Carl Jung observed throughout his life. He understood that most human conflicts are born from unconsciousness, not from deliberate malice, but from an inability to see what is happening within us. And until a person develops awareness of their own thoughts, fears, desires, and emotional wounds, they remain vulnerable to anyone who knows how to exploit those hidden regions. Think about that for a moment. How can someone protect their boundaries if they don't even know where those boundaries are? How can someone recognize emotional manipulation if they don't understand their own emotions? How can someone trust their own perception if they've spent their entire life ignoring their intuition? This is exactly where everything begins. And perhaps that's precisely why some people feel uncomfortable around self-aware individuals. Because a person who develops awareness starts noticing small details that once went unnoticed. They see inconsistencies, they recognize patterns, they spot contradictions. They listen not only to what is being said, but also to what remains hidden between the words, and that completely changes the dynamics of relationships. You begin to notice when someone tries to make you feel guilty for no reason. You recognize when criticism is disguised as advice. You identify when someone is trying to control your emotions through fear, approval, or rejection. And the most interesting part is that often you don't even react. You simply notice, but that silent awareness is already enough to change everything. Because manipulators depend on emotional predictability. They need to know which buttons to push. They need to understand your insecurities better than you do. They need access to your blind spots. But when you begin a genuine journey of self-discovery, those blind spots start to disappear. And that's when something curious happens. People who once seemed extremely confident begin showing irritation for no apparent reason. People who previously controlled conversations become defensive. People who always had an answer for everything begin looking uncomfortable when faced with simple questions, not because you've become aggressive, not because you've decided to confront anyone, but because your awareness has started illuminating areas that once remained hidden. Jung said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Perhaps this is one of the most important statements for understanding what we're discussing here. Because when someone begins to recognize their own patterns, fears, and emotional wounds, they stop being unconsciously driven by them, and a person who can no longer be unconsciously guided becomes much harder to manipulate. But there's one detail about this process that almost no one notices. A detail that explains why some people seem to react so intensely when they encounter someone who is truly self-aware. And to understand that, we need to talk about something that goes far beyond ordinary manipulation, something Carl Jung considered one of the most powerful and least understood forces of the human psyche. There is a very common belief. When it comes to emotional manipulation, most people imagine that manipulators hate strong, dominant, confident, or difficult-to-challenge individuals. It seems logical, doesn't it? After all, if someone wants to control another person, they would naturally struggle against someone strong. But here's the twist that almost nobody notices. Many manipulators successfully control people who are extremely intelligent, highly competent, and seemingly very strong. In fact, some of the most capable people you know may be being manipulated right now without even realizing it. So if strength isn't what scares a manipulator, what is? The answer may completely change the way you see human relationships. What truly threatens a manipulator is not someone strong, it's someone conscious. And there's a huge difference between those two things. Strong person may win arguments. A conscious person doesn't always need to argue. A strong person may react. A conscious person observes first. A strong person may confront. A conscious person can see, and it is precisely this ability to see that creates a silent discomfort in those who depend on manipulation to exert influence. Think about how many times you've believed you needed to be tougher, colder, or more dominant in order to protect yourself from the wrong people. Perhaps you've spent years trying to build a kind of emotional armor. But Carl Jung observed something different. For him, true psychological power did not come from resistance. It came from awareness, because awareness illuminates what manipulation needs to keep hidden. That is why many self-aware people go through a strange experience. The more they awaken to themselves, the less they are able to participate in certain emotional games. Not because they have become better than others, but because they begin to notice mechanisms that once went unseen and whom apparently innocent comment starts carrying a different meaning. Criticism disguised as concern begins to sound. Different excessive praise starts to seem suspicious. An attempt to induce guilt becomes visible. And the most fascinating part is that this change happens internally. Before it appears externally, you begin to feel that something doesn't fit. You can't explain it. You don't have concrete proof, but there's a growing sense that something is out of place. Very often, this is exactly the moment when the manipulator begins to grow uneasy, because there is one very specific characteristic of self-aware people. They gradually learn to trust their own perception, and that is devastating for any attempt at psychological control. Notice the pattern. Manipulators tend to thrive when they can make you doubt yourself. They want you to question your memory, question your emotions, question your boundaries, question your intuition, question your own reality. But when a person develops deep self-awareness, Something changes. They still experience doubt. They still feel fear. They still make mistakes. The difference is that they no longer abandon their own perception so easily, and that completely changes the dynamics of the relationship. That is why some people seem to like you as long as you're seeking approval, but become uncomfortable when you start trusting yourself. That is why some people praise your kindness, yet criticize your boundaries. That is why certain relationships begin to feel strange precisely when you embark on a genuine journey of awakening, because what feels like independence to you may feel like a loss of control to someone else. And there's something even more uncomfortable. Here, manipulators are not always consciously aware of what they're doing. This is one of the most important things to understand. Many people imagine manipulators as calculating villains, carefully planning every move. While some certainly are, many operate unconsciously. They learned certain emotional patterns throughout their lives. They learned that control creates a sense of security. They learned that influence provides protection. They learned that shaping other people helps reduce their own insecurities. And when they encounter a self-aware person, they feel threatened without fully understanding why. They feel resistance, they feel discomfort, they feel irritation, but they rarely identify the true source of those feelings. Carl Jung believed that what remains unconscious does not disappear. It continues operating behind the scenes of the mind. It continues shaping behaviors, emotions, and relationships. And this is exactly where things become fascinating, because the discomfort a manipulator feels around a self-aware person may not actually be about that person. It may be about what that person awakens. It may be connected to something they have spent their entire life trying to avoid, something hidden in the deepest regions of the psyche, something Jung called the shadow. And when a person awakens to themselves, they don't just become harder to manipulate. They also begin to function as a living mirror for those who are still running from important parts of themselves. This is where the story stops being merely about emotional manipulation and begins revealing one of the deepest mechanisms of human behavior, because there is a far more powerful psychological reason behind this. Silent conflict between awareness and control, a reason that explains why some people react so intensely to someone who has simply chosen to look within. Now we arrive at the point where most people begin to see their own story reflected in this conversation. Because up to this point, we've been talking about manipulation, awareness, and self-knowledge. But there is an even deeper layer beneath all of it. A layer that Carl Jung devoted much of his life to understanding. And once you grasp this mechanism, many seemingly confusing experiences begin to make sense. Jung believed that there is a part of our psyche we prefer not to see, a region made up of repressed emotions, denied desires, hidden fears, buried insecurities, and traits that don't fit the image we have constructed of ourselves. He called this region the shadow. And here's something few people understand. The shadow is not made up only of negative qualities. It also contains strengths, talents, desires, and truths that we learn to hide in order to be accepted by others. But regardless of its contents, whatever remains in the shadow continues to influence our behavior. That is why Jung said, "What you resist persists." Now think about someone who has spent their entire life avoiding self-examination. Someone who has never confronted their deepest insecurities. Someone who built their identity on masks, external validation, or the need for control. That person may appear confident on the outside, but internally they are still running from important aspects of their own reality. Then along comes a self-aware person, someone who has begun questioning their own patterns, someone who recognizes their mistakes, someone who acknowledges their vulnerabilities, someone willing to face their own shadow. And something interesting happens without realizing it. That person becomes a mirror, and mirrors are not always welcome, because when you encounter someone who is truly conscious, it becomes harder to keep pretending to yourself. Their mere presence can awaken discomforts. that have been dormant for years. Perhaps you've experienced this without understanding it. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to react disproportionately to completely normal behavior? You ask a simple question and they become defensive. You establish a healthy boundary and they interpret it as an attack. You calmly express an opinion and they react as if they are being challenged. Very often, their reaction has little to do with what you did. It has everything to do with what your actions awaken within them. This is one of the most important concepts in Jungian analytical psychology. Projection. When we cannot recognize something within ourselves, we tend to see that content in other people. The controlling person accuses others of trying to control them. The manipulative person accuses others of being manipulative. The envious person accuses others of envy. The insecure person accuses others of arrogance. And the more unconscious someone is of these aspects, the more intensely they tend to project them. Now imagine what happens when a person who is accustomed to projecting encounters someone who is self-aware. The strategy begins to fail. Because self-aware people develop a rare ability. They observe before they absorb. Not every criticism is automatically accepted. Not every guilt trip is carried. Not every accusation is internalized. Not every external narrative replaces their own perception. And that creates a huge problem for anyone who lives through projection, because projection only works when it finds someone willing to carry it. That is exactly why manipulators often feel uncomfortable around people who are in the process of psychological awakening. Not because those people are perfect, not because they have all the answers, but because they begin to see invisible mechanisms. They begin to recognize when an emotion does not belong to them. They begin to distinguish responsibility from guilt. They begin to differentiate empathy from submission. They begin to separate love from emotional dependency. And this transformation is silent. You don't need to announce that you're changing. You don't need to confront anyone. You don't need to prove anything. Your awareness does the work on its own. Perhaps that is why some relationships change so dramatically when you begin a journey of self-discovery. The same behaviors that once worked no longer work. The same manipulations lose their power. The same attempts at control no longer produce the same results. And often, the other person doesn't understand what happened. They simply feel that they've lost access to something. But there is an even deeper observation Jung made. Something that goes beyond projection, manipulation, and even the shadow itself. Because the real reason manipulators feel threatened by self-aware people is not simply that they see more, it is related to what they stop providing. There is a psychological fuel that sustains virtually every dynamic of emotional control. An invisible fuel, yet an extraordinarily powerful one. And when a person awakens to themselves, that fuel begins to disappear, often without them even realizing it's happening. There comes a specific moment when the entire dynamic changes, a quiet, almost invisible moment that most people don't even notice when it happens. It's not when you learn a new emotional defense technique. It's not when you read a psychology book. It's not when you finally confront someone. The turning point happens when you stop supplying what sustains the manipulation. And here is the insight that can completely transform the way you interpret your relationships. Manipulators don't feed only on control. They feed on unconsciousness. Think about that for a few seconds. Every attempt at manipulation depends on one fundamental thing, a predictable reaction. If someone knows exactly how to trigger your guilt, they can influence your decisions. If someone knows exactly how to activate your fear of rejection, they can control your behavior. If someone knows your deepest insecurities, they can steer your emotions without you realizing it. But all of this depends on one condition. You must not be aware of what's happening. That is why self-awareness is so powerful, because it interrupts the process at the exact moment it tries to begin. Imagine someone pressing the same button for years and always getting the same response. Now imagine that suddenly the button stops working. They press it again. Nothing happens. They try once more. Nothing. They persist, and they still don't get the result they expected. That is exactly how many manipulators feel when they encounter someone who has developed deep self-awareness. And the most interesting part is that this change rarely happens aggressively. In fact, it is usually remarkably calm. You simply begin to notice. You notice when you're feeling guilty for something you didn't do. You notice when you're taking responsibility for things that aren't yours. You notice when you're trying to save people who don't want to change. You notice when you're sacrificing your peace of mind to maintain other people's approval. And from that moment on, your decisions begin to change, not because you've become colder, but because you've become more aware. Carl Jung believed that individuation, the process of becoming who you truly are, requires the courage to let go of old versions of yourself. And one of the hardest versions to leave behind is the one that constantly seeks external validation. Because as long as you desperately need someone's approval, that person holds power over you. As long as your self-worth depends on other people's recognition, your freedom remains limited. As long as your identity is built upon external opinions, your consciousness does not fully belong to you. That is why manipulators feel so uncomfortable around self-aware people. Not because these people are perfect, but because they begin to reclaim ownership of their inner world. And when that happens, something extremely important is no longer available. Access. Manipulators need emotional access. They need access to your fears. They need access to your insecurities. They need access to your need for belonging. They need access to your wounds. But a conscious person does not hand over those keys so easily. They know their vulnerabilities. They recognize their pain. They accept their imperfections. And precisely because of that, they become less susceptible to those who try to exploit those areas. Perhaps you've already experienced this transformation without realizing it. Maybe you've noticed that certain conversations no longer affect you the way they once did. Maybe some criticisms have lost their power. Maybe certain judgments no longer define your worth. Maybe people who once had enormous emotional influence over you now seem much smaller, not because they changed, but because you changed. And this is one of the most liberating experiences of psychological awakening. You begin to understand that not every opinion deserves space in your mind. Not every criticism deserves your energy. Not every provocation deserves your reaction. Not every person deserves access to your consciousness. That last statement is especially important because many people spend their entire lives protecting their money, time, and material possessions, yet allow anyone to enter their mental space freely. They allow strangers to define their worth. They allow manipulators to dictate their mood. They allow unconscious people to influence their perception of reality. And then they wonder why they live in a state of emotional exhaustion. The truth is that awareness functions like an inner guardian. The more it grows, the more selective you become about who is allowed to influence your mind. And that selectiveness does not come from ego. It comes from psychological maturity. It comes from self-knowledge. It comes from understanding that your peace of mind has value. But there is one final piece of this puzzle that almost no one notices, because when a person becomes truly self-aware, something even deeper happens. They stop fighting a constant battle against manipulators and begin asking a far more important question. A question that doesn't point toward others, a question that points inward. Because in the end, the greatest power is not identifying who is trying to control you. The greatest power is discovering which part of your own mind can still be controlled. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to fall apart when they can no longer control the way you think about yourself? At first, it may seem like envy, resentment, or simply a personality clash. But as you begin paying closer attention, you realize something much deeper is happening. There is a reason manipulators feel deeply uncomfortable around self-aware people, and that reason has nothing to do with physical strength, social status, or financial power. Most people believe manipulators look for weak victims, but that's only part of the truth. What they really seek are people who are disconnected from themselves, people who constantly doubt their own perceptions, people who need other people's approval to validate their emotions, people who have not yet developed a deep relationship with their own consciousness. That is exactly why self-awareness becomes a silent threat. When you begin to recognize your own emotional patterns, your wounds, your triggers, and your shadows, something changes within you. You stop being predictable to those who want to control your mind. You begin to notice when someone is trying to provoke guilt, fear, insecurity, or emotional dependency. And that awareness completely changes the dynamics of the relationship. Carl Jung said, "Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate." That statement contains a powerful truth that many manipulators would rather you never understand. Because as long as you remain unconscious, your emotions can be used against you. As long as you don't understand your own fears, someone can trigger them. As long as you don't recognize your own wounds, someone can exploit them. As long as you don't see your own patterns, someone can steer your decisions without you even noticing. But the moment you begin looking inward, everything starts to change. And perhaps that's exactly what you've experienced without realizing it. Maybe you've noticed that some people began pulling away when you started setting boundaries. Maybe certain friendships changed when you stopped accepting everything in silence. Maybe some people became irritated when you simply started asking questions. Maybe you've been called cold, distant, arrogant, or difficult to control simply because you decided to get to know yourself better. If that has happened to you, there is a much deeper psychological reason than it may seem. Because manipulators are not afraid of your strength. They are afraid of your clarity. And there is one specific sign that virtually every self-aware person begins to develop without realizing it. A sign that causes manipulators to lose one of their most important tools. And that invisible mechanism is exactly what we're going to talk about now. Topic 5. The final hook and the question that changes everything. Imagine for a moment that a manipulator's true goal was never to control your actions. What if the goal had always been to control the way you interpret reality? That question seems simple, but it can completely transform the way you view all your relationships. Because the most dangerous form of manipulation rarely happens through direct commands. It happens through the distortion of perception. A manipulator doesn't just want you to do something. They want you to believe the decision was yours. They don't just want to influence your emotions. They want you to doubt your own emotions. They don't just want to control your behavior. They want to control the internal narrative that exists within your mind. And this is exactly where the inevitable conflict between the manipulator and the self-aware person begins. A self-aware person develops a habit that is extremely dangerous to anyone who manipulates others. They observe themselves while living through their experiences. They don't just feel, they observe what they feel. They don't just react, they observe why they are reacting. They don't automatically accept an emotion, they investigate its source. And this simple process creates something that Jung considered essential for psychological development, the ability to witness one's own mind. When you learn to observe your thoughts, they no longer control you with the same intensity. When you learn to observe your emotions, they stop being open doors for manipulation. When you learn to observe your fears, they stop being invisible chains. That is why many people begin facing resistance precisely when they start a deep process of self-discovery. Without realizing it, they are stepping out of an invisible system of influence. They are no longer reacting automatically. They are no longer seeking constant validation. They are no longer handing emotional control over to other people, and that creates discomfort in those who benefited from their inner confusion. But there is an even deeper question, and perhaps it is the most important question in this entire video. If manipulators hate self-aware people because they cannot be easily controlled, then how many of the decisions in your life were truly yours? How many opinions did you form because you genuinely believed them? And how many were built from the expectations, pressures, and influences of other people? How many fears are truly yours? How many insecurities were born within you? And how many were planted over the years? Jung believed that the process of individuation begins when a person stops living the identity others created for them and starts discovering who they truly are. But that raises a new question, a question that very few people have the courage to face, because discovering who you are first requires discovering who you are not. And when that discovery begins, some masks fall away, some relationships change, some truths emerge, and not everyone will be ready for the version of you that emerges from that process, which makes the next reflection even more important. Because there is a tremendous difference between being awake to others and being awake to yourself. And it is precisely at this point that most people realize their greatest battle was never against the manipulators around them, but against something much closer and much harder to see. If you've made it this far, perhaps it's because some part of this message touched something you felt for a long time, but never found the words to express. Maybe it reminded you of someone, or perhaps you realized that for a long time you've been trying to understand why certain people seemed so bothered by your presence, your clarity, or your ability to see beyond appearances. The truth is that manipulators do not hate self-aware people by accident. They fear them because self-awareness shatters illusions, it weakens masks, it exposes psychological games that once operated without resistance. As Carl Jung said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And that is exactly what manipulative people try to prevent. They don't want you to awaken. They don't want you to see. They don't want you to realize. If this reflection resonated with you, if at any point during this video you thought, this is exactly what I'm going through, then this channel was made for people like you. Subscribe now to continue deepening your self-awareness, gaining a better understanding of human psychology, exploring the teachings of Carl Jung, and learning how to identify patterns that most people never notice. And I want to hear from you. Does this message reflect something you've felt or experienced? Write in the comments, I see beyond the masks. Or share the experience that impacted you the most while watching this video. Many times, putting something into words is the first step towards seeing our own reality more clearly. If this content added value to your life, leave a like. That's simple. Gesture helps this message reach other people who are also trying to free themselves from manipulation, emotional confusion, and the invisible games that drain their energy. And share this video with someone who needs to hear it. Perhaps there is someone close to you who is still trapped in a dynamic they cannot fully understand. This message may be the awakening they need. Now don't stop here. Watch the next recommended video on your screen, because there is an even deeper sign that reveals when someone is trying to control your mind without you realizing it. And once you understand that mechanism, you'll begin noticing behaviors that previously went completely unnoticed. Thank you for staying until the end. I'll see you in the next video.